Before we begin, if stories about ambition turning into obsession fascinate you, if you want to understand how billions of dollars can vanish behind a single promise, subscribe, like, and tell me in the comments, how far would you go to change the world? Because this story isn't just about money. It's about belief, and how America believed her. In the early 2000s, Silicon Valley was addicted to disruption. Tech founders were gods. Dropouts were visionaries. And the next Steve Jobs was always just around the corner. Then came a 19-year-old Stanford student named Elizabeth Holmes. She had piercing blue eyes, an intense stare, and an idea that sounded almost too good to be true. A machine that could run hundreds of blood tests from a single finger prick. No more vials. No more painful needles. No more waiting days for results. Just a drop of blood. And a revolution in healthcare. Holmes dropped out of Stanford in 2003 and founded a company called Theranos. The name blended therapy and diagnosis. It sounded clinical, inevitable. From the beginning, she spoke in absolutes. Healthcare is broken. People deserve access. We can change everything. She modeled herself after Steve Jobs: black turtlenecks, minimalism, rehearsed keynotes. Even her voice was striking, deep, measured, almost hypnotic. Investors leaned in when she spoke. Journalists described her as magnetic. And she told a story Silicon Valley desperately wanted to believe: that technology could fix medicine the way it fixed communication. The pitch was simple. Theranos had developed a compact device, nicknamed Edison, that could perform hundreds of blood tests quickly and cheaply using microsamples. It would be deployed in pharmacies, clinics, even homes. Results in minutes. Lives saved. It was the kind of idea that made people feel morally superior just for investing in it. By 2010, Holmes was raising hundreds of millions of dollars. Her board of directors read like a roster of American power: former secretaries of state, senators, military generals. Most had no background in laboratory science, but they had influence, and they trusted her. Walgreens partnered with Theranos to roll out testing centers inside stores. Patients in Arizona walked into pharmacies and had their fingers pricked, believing they were witnessing the future of medicine. Behind closed doors, however, something was wrong. The Edison machines were unreliable. Tests failed. Results were inconsistent. Engineers struggled to make the technology work as advertised. Inside the company, there was a culture of secrecy. Employees were siloed into departments and discouraged from asking questions. Non-disclosure agreements were aggressive. Security was tight. If you raised concerns, you risked being pushed out. Some former employees later described an atmosphere of fear. Meetings where executives demanded absolute loyalty. A sense that questioning the technology meant betraying the mission. But outside the company, the myth grew. By 2014, Holmes was on the covers of major magazines. She was hailed as the youngest self-made female billionaire. Her net worth was estimated at $4.5 billion. Theranos was valued at $9 billion. She gave TED-style talks about democratizing healthcare. Politicians praised her. Investors doubled down. Patients lined up. No one, not the media, not the board, not the powerful men in suits, publicly demanded hard proof. Because belief was easier. But inside Theranos labs, technicians sometimes used traditional commercial machines to run patient samples. Machines made by other companies, while publicly claiming tests were run on Edison devices. Accuracy problems persisted. Some patients received alarming results that later turned out to be wrong. False positives. False negatives. Imagine being told you might have cancer. Or that you're at risk of miscarriage. Based on faulty data. Behind the sleek marketing and black turtlenecks, the foundation was cracking. In 2015, everything began to shift. A reporter at the Wall Street Journal started asking questions. His name was John Carreyrou. Carreyrou received tips from former Theranos employees who claimed the technology didn't work. At first, it sounded unbelievable. How could a $9 billion company, backed by some of the most powerful people in America, be built on faulty science? Holmes fought back hard. Theranos sent lawyers. They threatened former employees. They warned Carreyrou's sources of devastating lawsuits if they spoke. The company insisted the technology was revolutionary and that critics simply didn't understand it. But Carreyrou kept digging. In October 2015, the Wall Street Journal published an explosive investigation alleging that Theranos devices could perform only a small fraction of the tests it claimed, and that most blood samples were being run on traditional machines. It was the first crack in the illusion. Holmes went on television to defend herself. Composed, unshaken. "This is what happens when you work to change things," she said. First they think you're crazy. Then they fight you. Then all of a sudden you change the world. It was a powerful narrative. But this time the data wasn't on her side. Federal regulators began inspecting Theranos labs. Findings revealed serious deficiencies in testing processes. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services cited the company for violations that posed immediate jeopardy to patient health and safety. Walgreens suspended operations. Investors panicked. And employees, some of whom had believed deeply in the mission, watched as the company's story began to unravel. The girl who promised to revolutionize medicine was now facing accusations that her technology had never worked the way she claimed. Still, Holmes didn't concede. She insisted the company was transitioning to a new device. She blamed misunderstandings. She framed it as growing pains of innovation. But regulators were closing in. The myth of the billionaire visionary was collapsing under the weight of evidence. And America was about to confront a terrifying possibility. What if the billion-dollar breakthrough was a billion-dollar illusion? Chapter 1 ends with the dream still flickering, but the spotlight is getting hotter. And in the next chapter, that spotlight becomes an interrogation lamp. By early 2016, the dream was no longer glossy. It was audited. Regulators descended on Theranos with clipboards and subpoenas. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services issued a scathing report detailing failures in quality control, inaccurate test results, and unqualified personnel handling complex laboratory procedures. The language wasn't vague. It warned of immediate jeopardy to patient health. In medicine, those words are radioactive. Inside Theranos headquarters in Palo Alto, the atmosphere shifted from visionary to defensive. Lawyers became as common as engineers. Internal meetings revolved less around innovation and more around containment. Employees whispered in hallways. Some had already left. Others feared speaking. The company voided or corrected thousands of test results from patients in Arizona. Imagine receiving a letter telling you the medical information you relied on, perhaps for months, might have been wrong. Wrong cholesterol levels. Wrong hormone readings. Wrong cancer markers. For a company that promised to democratize healthcare, the consequences were deeply personal. But publicly, Elizabeth Holmes held her posture. The black turtlenecks didn't disappear. The voice remained steady. She framed the crisis as regulatory overreach and temporary setbacks. Behind that composure, however, federal investigators were assembling something far more dangerous than bad press. They were building a fraud case. Investors who once praised Holmes began requesting documentation, data, peer-reviewed studies, independent validation. For years, many had relied on her charisma and the prestige of the board rather than hard scientific proof. Now, under scrutiny, that absence of proof became glaring. By mid-2016, CMS banned Holmes from owning or operating a laboratory for 2 years. Walgreens terminated its partnership. Theranos shuttered its blood testing centers. The company that once claimed it would replace traditional labs was now barred from running one. And still, Holmes didn't step aside. She pivoted. Theranos announced it would focus on developing a mini-lab, a next-generation device that supposedly solved earlier technical issues. The strategy was clear: promise the future again, buy time in the present. But time was running out. In 2017 and 2018, the pressure intensified. The Securities and Exchange Commission launched an investigation into whether Theranos had misled investors about its technology and financial performance. The SEC alleged that Holmes and former President Ramesh Sunny Balwani had raised more than $700 million from investors through an elaborate, years-long fraud. The language was brutal. According to the complaint, investors were told the technology was being used by the U.S. Department of Defense in Afghanistan. They were told Theranos would generate hundreds of millions in revenue. They were shown demonstrations that didn't reflect real-world performance. Holmes agreed to a civil settlement with the SEC in 2018. She paid a fine, relinquished control of the company, and was barred from serving as an officer or director of a public company for 10 years. But the settlement didn't include an admission of guilt. The real battle was still ahead. That same year, federal prosecutors indicted Holmes and Balwani on multiple counts of wire fraud and conspiracy to commit wire fraud. Each count carried the possibility of decades in prison. Theranos, once valued at $9 billion, dissolved shortly after. The empire collapsed not with a dramatic explosion, but with a quiet shutdown notice. And then came the trial. When Holmes entered the federal courthouse in San Jose in 2021, she was no longer the untouchable billionaire prodigy. She was a defendant. The courtroom became the stage Silicon Valley had avoided for years. Prosecutors painted a picture of deliberate deception. They argued that Holmes knew the technology was flawed, that she exaggerated capabilities to secure funding and partnerships, and that she prioritized image over accuracy. They presented emails, investor presentations, internal documents, testimony from former employees who described intense pressure to stay silent. One former lab director testified that he warned leadership about accuracy issues. Others described being marginalized or dismissed after raising concerns. The prosecution's argument was simple: this wasn't failed innovation, it was fraud. Holmes' defense team countered with a different narrative. They argued she was a young, ambitious founder who believed deeply in her technology. They claimed she relied on others for technical execution. They suggested she was misled by subordinates, including Balwani. And in one of the trial's most startling developments, Holmes testified that she had endured emotional and sexual abuse during her relationship with Balwani, which she said affected her decision-making and mental state. The courtroom absorbed it all. The trial lasted months. Jurors sifted through complex financial documents and scientific testimony. They heard from investors who said they felt betrayed. They heard from patients whose trust had been shaken. Outside, the public watched with fascination. How had so many powerful people, venture capitalists, former cabinet members, military leaders, been convinced? Was it greed? Was it hero worship? Or was it something more American than that? The desire to believe in the next big thing. The mythology of the lone genius. Silicon Valley had built an ecosystem where fake it till you make it was almost a mantra. Exaggerate potential. Sell the vision. Perfect the product later. But healthcare isn't an app. You can't beta test someone's blood. In January 2022, after more than 50 hours of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict. Elizabeth Holmes was found guilty on 4 counts of fraud related to defrauding investors. She was acquitted on some other charges and the jury deadlocked on several counts involving patients. It wasn't a total victory for prosecutors, but it was decisive. The billionaire icon was now a convicted felon. The sentencing came later that year, more than 11 years in federal prison. For some, it felt like justice. For others, it raised uncomfortable questions. Holmes wasn't the only person in Silicon Valley to exaggerate projections. She wasn't the only founder to sell a dream before delivering results. But she was the one whose dream involved blood and trust. As she prepared to begin her prison sentence, the image of the black turtleneck lingered in public memory. The steady voice, the promise of revolution. It had all felt so convincing, so inevitable, so American. In the next chapter we confront the aftermath, the legacy of the lie, the lives affected, and the chilling question that still echoes through Silicon Valley. If it happened once, could it happen again? When the sentence was finally handed down, the courtroom was silent. 11 years and 3 months. That was the price the judge assigned to the illusion. Elizabeth Holmes stood composed as the decision was read. No black turtleneck this time. No TED stage lighting. No carefully controlled interviews. Just fluorescent courtroom lights and the weight of federal conviction. Outside, cameras waited. Some saw a fallen visionary. Others saw a calculated fraudster. Most saw something far more unsettling, a mirror held up to American ambition. Holmes reported to federal prison in 2023. The woman once celebrated as the youngest self-made female billionaire was now inmate number 24,965 to 111. The transformation was almost cinematic, except it was real. But prison bars don't end a story like this. Because the real damage had already been done. Investors lost hundreds of millions of dollars. Some were billionaires who could absorb the blow. Others were family offices and smaller funds that trusted the narrative of revolution. Patients were left questioning lab results that had once shaped medical decisions. Thousands of tests conducted by Theranos were voided, corrected, erased. For some patients, the fear lingered longer than the paperwork. In Silicon Valley, it moved on, uneasily. The Holmes scandal didn't just expose one company's deception. It exposed a culture. For years, startup founders had operated under a philosophy of exaggeration. Promise scale before it exists. Project revenue before it materializes. Sell the dream first. In software, failure is inconvenient. In medicine, failure is dangerous. Holmes had blurred that line. Prosecutors argued that she knowingly misled investors about Theranos' capabilities. That she presented doctored demonstrations. That she overstated military contracts and financial projections. Her defense insisted she believed in the technology. That she was overly optimistic, not criminal. But belief, the jury decided, wasn't enough. And neither was charisma. The trial forced uncomfortable conversations in boardrooms across America. How had so many high-profile figures joined Theranos' board without deep expertise in laboratory science? Why did prestige substitute for proof? Former secretaries of state, retired generals, political powerhouses. The board looked impressive, but it lacked medical scrutiny. It was a lesson in optics over substance. Meanwhile, journalists who had once praised Holmes revisited their coverage. Magazine covers that called her the next Steve Jobs became artifacts of misplaced faith. Profiles that admired her discipline and mystique now read differently. The myth had been intoxicating. Young woman, male-dominated industry, world-changing mission. It was a narrative too perfect to question. And that's what made it powerful. Holmes' partner and former Theranos president, Ramesh Sunny Balwani, was also convicted of fraud in a separate trial and sentenced to nearly 13 years in prison. The empire's leadership fell together. But even as prison sentences closed one chapter, the cultural ripple effects continued. Universities used Theranos as a case study in ethics courses. Business schools debated whether Holmes was a visionary who crossed a line, or a con artist from the beginning. Whistleblowers, once silenced by fear of lawsuits, were reframed as heroes. Among them were former employees who risked careers to expose inconsistencies. And journalist John Carreyrou, whose investigation cracked the facade, became a symbol of persistent accountability. The story entered documentaries, books, podcasts. It became modern corporate folklore. But beneath the headlines, a more chilling question lingered. Was Holmes uniquely deceptive? Or did she simply push Silicon Valley's unwritten rules too far? In tech culture, founders are taught to sell the vision. To convince investors that the impossible is inevitable. To speak in certainties even when engineering is uncertain. Holmes mastered that language. She spoke in calm, declarative sentences. She projected inevitability. She created urgency. And America listened. Because Americans love transformation stories. Garage startups becoming empires. College dropouts becoming billionaires. Outsiders disrupting industries. Theranos fit perfectly into that mythology, until it didn't. In the end, the Edison machine never delivered on its sweeping promises. The compact device that was supposed to replace traditional laboratories became evidence in a federal courtroom. The billion-dollar valuation evaporated. The partnerships collapsed. The myth disintegrated. But the deeper lesson wasn't about one machine. It was about trust. Healthcare depends on it. Investors depend on it. Patients stake their lives on it. When that trust is manipulated, the fallout extends far beyond balance sheets. Holmes has since appealed her conviction, maintaining that she never intended to deceive. Legal battles continue. Supporters argue she was made an example of. Critics argue she deserved even harsher punishment. The debate persists. Yet the facts remain. Theranos raised over $700 million from investors. It claimed revolutionary technology that independent investigations found unreliable. Federal jurors concluded that key statements to investors were fraudulent. And the woman once worth billions now serves time in a federal facility. The rise had been meteoric. The fall was historic. In the aftermath, Silicon Valley became slightly more cautious. Investors began asking harder questions. Regulators looked more closely at health tech claims. Founders felt the weight of a cautionary tale hovering over pitch decks. Somewhere in a startup incubator right now, a founder is promising to change the world. Somewhere in a boardroom, investors are nodding. And somewhere in a lab, a prototype is being tested. The line between ambition and deception is thin. Elizabeth Holmes walked that line, and fell. The billion-dollar lie didn't just fool investors. It fooled a nation that wanted to believe innovation could cure everything. And that may be the most unsettling truth of all. Because as long as we crave the next miracle, there will always be someone ready to sell it.